Understanding Whitman's poetry. Walt Whitman published in 1855 Leaves of Grass, a collection of poems he would continue to revise and edit until his death. The poems in Leaves of Grass were different from the popular poetry from that period, which dealt with religious and spiritual themes. Whitman chose instead to write about the human experience and the natural world. Whitman referred to different themes in his work, such as the democratic self. Whitman celebrates the common man by creating an unified, overarching concept of the self that applies to individuals as well. Whitman usually casts himself as the main character of his poetry, but the man he refers to is just a representation of his own opinions and experiences. He also used I as himself to represent the archetypal American man. This technique, an all-powerful I, allowed him to draw all Americans into an unified identity with the poet as the figurehead. Individualism. Individualism is very prevalent in Whitman's work. Like Whitman, many powerful thinkers, politicians, and writers encouraged everyday Americans to exercise self-ownership and value original thought. Whitman's poetry addressed the role of the individual within a collective society while simultaneously emphasizing the importance of self-expression. Democratic nature of poetry. Whitman saw his poems as more than words. He points out the democratic power of poetry. He wrote poetry that was thought to be spoken aloud, and he used it to celebrate the struggles of the common man so that he could read his readers' hearts and minds. The body and the soul. Whitman emphasizes the connection between the body and the soul repeatedly in his poetry. He said the human soul consisted of two parts, mind and body. The body would be the vessel through which the soul experiences the world and is therefore sacred. He finds God in nature and in the human body. The natural world. Whitman believed that nature facilitated connection between human beings over time, distance, and superficial differences. All human beings, no matter who they were or where they were from, would interact with the same elements of nature. War. During his career, he experienced the Civil War. Therefore, many of these poems addressed themes of war and the loss of humanity that resulted from physical conflict. Whitman was a patriotic man, but he was also a pacifist, so he believed that war was useless and that fighting was never an effective solution. Eroticism. His fascination with the human body drove him to explore themes of both romantic and sexual love in his poetry. Whitman believed that humans should never be ashamed of their physical desires because the human body was a sacred vessel of the soul. Whitman also used the same characters in his poetry. However, in the example we only find the I. Whitman uses an all-encompassing I that functions as an inclusive first-person narrator. His use of this character is an effective technique in actualizing the concept of the democratic self and establishing poetry as a democratizing medium. The modern man is an ideal of American society that Whitman hoped to achieve through this poetry. We can also see how he uses capital letters to emphasize the following characters, such as democratic, modern man, female, muse, form, female, male, and life. In Oneself I Sing, Whitman addresses the successive themes we have explained before. The speaker begins by claiming that the poem is an ode to oneself, an individual, but then he expands the scope of the poem by applying it to individuals en masse, using capital letters for emphasizing it. According to this poem, Whitman's ensuing poetry encompassed both the individual and the collective, democratic mass. Other themes we can see in this poem are the body, when talking about men and women, and also life and passion. The poem finishes with the idea of the modern man. This poem is the first one from Inscriptions, which is the first book of Leaves of Grass. The poem functions as a setter of the tone for the rest of the book when he introduces himself, the I, that will talk throughout the book about sexuality, democracy, the human body, and the modern society. There is where we can see that though this poem just has three stanzas, it encompasses all the themes and ideas Whitman will explain in detail in the rest of his poetry. In the first stanza, a couplet, Whitman embodies the so-called good great poet's obsession of being a separate person and, at the same time, a mass. What is unique about this poem is its brevity and that the first line is so short but full of alliteration. With the second stanza, Whitman makes a modern turn. He uses what his predecessors would deem non-poetic language, such as the terms physiology and physiognomy, and he is celebrating the beauty and the natural affairs of human beings. These words give the speaker a voice that seems to come from ancient science, and at the same time he is noting that both appearance and intelligence are not worthy for the muse, allows to his understanding of past poetry. The narrator proves his ethos and does so while using a scientific jargon. This poem is a juxtaposition of modern form and ideas against highfalutin ideas that the poet saw as the meaning of the power within all individuals. The scientific speak is cleared in the third and final stanza, where Whitman truly reveals his poetic talent. The seventh line of the poem uses alliteration to provide the reader with a sense of empowerment in life during a period where central ordering principles were being constantly unhinged. Whitman describes the modern man with the assonance in line 8, cheerful for freest action, a line that allows the reader freedom in an ornamental fashion and shows the fluid movement of the author. Whitman moved through this short poem as the master of verse he was, because the first stanza danced with the contemporary verse he aimed to replace. The second stanza furthered his passion for equality and his notion of separate togetherness. And the third and final stanza wraps the poem up by empowering the reader and flourishing his skill. Whitman alludes to the theme of gender, saying that he treats men and women equally in his poetry, the female equally with the male as seen. Whitman considers the woman equal to the man because his view of gender is tied to his definition of the soul. To him, women are just as sacred as men because they are all human and souls are free from gender. Contrary to the poetry that existed before Whitman's work, and also to the poetry we can find nowadays, Whitman's poems cannot be analyzed by stylistic devices only, but by symbolism and the use of alliteration. His poems are full of meaning and his symbolism touches pacifism, democracy, equality, and other themes that even in the 21st century are not globally achieved. Now we are going to do some exercises that will be explained in this lessons page.